Ron Paul is known for his libertarian views and his outspokenness on issues such as limited government, free markets, and non-interventionist foreign policy. Despite his popularity with grassroots supporters, Paul faced significant challenges in gaining media coverage during his political campaigns. During his presidential runs of 2008 and 2012, Paul often drew large crowds at his campaign rallies, yet mainstream media outlets provided little coverage of these events, which contributed to a sense of invisibility and marginalization for his supporters. Additionally, polls conducted after debates often showed Paul as the winner, only to be discredited by the very media and establishment figures who ran the poll and published it in favor of other candidates. This lack of coverage and the efforts to undermine his successes may have contributed to the rise of grassroots fundraising efforts such as the Money Bond campaign, which allowed supporters to donate significant amounts of money to his campaign in a short period of time. These fundraising efforts helped to further galvanize his supporters and raise awareness of his candidacy. Despite the challenges he faced, Paul was able to garner significant support from active duty military members, receiving more donations from this group than all other candidates in both parties combined. This was likely due to his non-interventionist foreign policy views and his opposition to costly and unnecessary military interventions. The rise of the Tea Party movement, which Paul played a significant role in shaping, was also fueled by frustration with the establishment and a desire for limited government and fiscal responsibility. However, as the movement gained traction, it was co-opted by neoconservatives and became increasingly aligned with the establishment wing of the Republican Party. In summary, Ron Paul faced significant challenges in gaining media coverage and recognition for his successes during his political campaigns. However, his grassroots fundraising efforts and appeal to active duty military members helped to build a dedicated base of support for his libertarian views. His influence on the Tea Party movement, while co-opted by others, also played a significant role in shaping the political landscape of the United States in the following years. There is a strong argument to be made that Ron Paul's lack of media coverage and the concerted efforts to discredit him were the result of a deliberate campaign by powerful interests within the government and the media. The cabal that many refer to as the shadowy elites who control the levers of power in the U.S. worked tirelessly to ensure that Paul's message of limited government, no central banking, and non-interventionist foreign policy would not gain a foothold in the American public's consciousness. It is true that both the Republican and Democratic parties, as well as many mainstream media outlets, were staunchly opposed to Ron Paul's candidacy. He was seen as a threat to the political establishment, which relied on big government and military interventionism to maintain its power and influence. But perhaps the true opposition to Ron Paul came from the Federal Reserve and the military-industrial complex. As a longtime critic of both, Paul posed a significant threat to the status quo, which relies heavily on the Federal Reserve's control of the nation's money supply and the military-industrial complex reliance on perpetual war to fuel its profits. These powerful interests had a vested interest in ensuring that Ron Paul's message was not heard. They controlled the mainstream media, which largely ignored or marginalized his campaign, and they had significant influence over many politicians on both sides of the aisle. Despite these efforts, however, Ron Paul was able to build a dedicated base of support among grassroots activists and military service members who were drawn to his message of limited government, free markets, and non-interventionist foreign policy. His Money Bomb fundraising campaigns were a testament to the enthusiasm and commitment of his supporters, and his impact on the Tea Party movement was significant, even if that movement was ultimately co-opted by neoconservatives and the Republican Party. In the end, Ron Paul's legacy may be as a symbol of resistance against the powerful forces that control the levers of power in the United States. His campaigns exposed the corruption and hypocrisy of the political establishment and showed that there is a growing movement of Americans who are disillusioned with the status quo and are seeking alternatives to the entrenched political system. Both the Republican and Democratic parties, as well as both sides of the mainstream media, came together in opposition to Paul, as his views challenged the status quo and threatened the interests of the political and financial elite. This was evidenced by the discrediting of polls that showed Paul as the winner of debates, as well as efforts to limit his speaking time and exclude him from debates altogether. The true opposition to Paul, however, likely came from the Federal Reserve and the military-industrial complex, which owned much of the media and controlled many politicians. Paul's opposition to the Federal Reserve and his advocacy for auditing and eventually ending it directly threatened the interests of this powerful institution. Similarly, his non-interventionist foreign policy views threatened the interests of the military-industrial complex, which relies on perpetual war and military intervention to sustain its profits. Despite these challenges, Paul was able to gain significant support from grassroots activists and military members who recognized the value of his message of limited government and non-interventionism. The rise of the Tea Party movement, which Paul played a significant role in shaping, was evidence of the growing frustration with the establishment and a desire for real change. In conclusion, Ron Paul faced significant opposition and marginalization from both major political parties and the mainstream media, which was likely due to his challenge to the status quo and the interests of the cable that controlled it. However, his message of limited government and non-interventionism resonated with many Americans, leading to the rise of grassroots activism and the Tea Party movement. Many in the Ron Paul movement had gone beyond simply being anti-establishment and became advocates for the philosophy of freedom. This group who became advocates for freedom then began to awake more and more people who were all at varying levels of coming from establishment to anti-establishment to freedom advocate. It is a three-step process. Before you can be an advocate for freedom, you first need to recognize what freedom is and that in the current establishment, we do not have it. Usually people recognize the absence of freedom before they have the right words for it, and it turns them against the establishment. In the tumultuous year of 2016, establishment elites faced a challenge they had not encountered before. A groundswell of anti-establishment sentiment had been building since the days of Ron Paul and the Tea Party movement. The elites knew they needed to maintain their control, and so they set their sights on co-opting this sentiment for their own purposes. Rand Paul, the son of Ron Paul, was in a prime position to tap into this anti-establishment sentiment and carry on the legacy of his father. However, Rand made the fatal mistake of toning down his message and trying to appeal to a broader base. This approach alienated the core base of anti-establishment voters, and it ultimately led to his failure to gain the nomination. Enter Donald Trump, a man with a long history of being part of the establishment, but who was marketed as the most anti-establishment candidate of them all. The establishment elites, aided by their control over the media, gave Trump 24/7's negative coverage, painting him as a disruptor and a threat to the status quo. But the negative coverage was precisely what the anti-establishment voters responded to. They saw it as proof that Trump was truly their candidate, even if he wasn't truly anti-establishment. This strategy allowed the establishment elites to co-opt the anti-establishment mood of the country and turn it into a cult of personality around Donald Trump. But let us not be fooled by this strategy. The point of putting Trump in the White House was not to upend the establishment, but rather to maintain control, having a controlled opposition in place, and to pacify the anti-establishment people to distract them from progressing to the philosophy of freedom. Trump was a fake bone thrown to those who wanted to buck the establishment, and many who identified as anti-establishment wanted that fake bone so bad and still don't want to give it up. This strategy not only squelched the Ron Paul movement, but it also prevented the anti-establishment sentiment of the country from coalescing around a truly principled candidate. Instead, it was directed towards Trump, who ultimately proved to be a disappointment to many of his supporters. We must learn from this experience and recognize the limitations of relying on charismatic leaders rather than building a community around shared principles of freedom and liberty. A campaign that is primarily against something is not even secondarily for anything. A campaign that is primarily for something is naturally against any opposition to itself, but only secondarily. The failure of the populist anti-establishment movement to produce real change is a cautionary tale about what can happen when your campaign is primarily based on being perceived as anti-establishment.